Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story. In October of 2020, a graduate researcher from Marshall University submitted a Freedom of Information request seeking records of unexplained emergency responses conducted by county search and rescue teams throughout southern Appalachia. The request covered a 10-year period and focused only on incidents that remained officially unresolved after all investigative procedures had been completed. Most of the returned files contained predictable outcomes. Lost hikers were eventually located, injured hunters were rescued, and missing campers were found after wandering off established trails. Buried among those reports, however, investigators found 3 unrelated cases from different counties that shared an unusual characteristic. Each had been closed without identifying a criminal act, yet every lead investigator attached the same handwritten observation before signing the final page. The available evidence explained what had happened. It never explained why. The earliest case began on July 11, 2014, when 2 experienced land surveyors were assigned to verify property boundaries inside a heavily wooded section of eastern Kentucky near the Appalachian foothills. Both men carried GPS equipment, satellite communication devices, and detailed topographic maps supplied by the county planning office. Their assignment covered less than 4 square miles and had been completed several times during previous years without incident. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, one surveyor contacted his supervisor to report that his partner had disappeared after walking no more than 100 yards ahead along an old logging trail. The caller insisted there had been no noise, no sign of injury, and no indication that the missing surveyor had intentionally left the worksite. He simply rounded a bend in the trail and failed to reappear. Search teams reached the location less than 90 minutes later and immediately treated the incident as a standard missing person investigation. Tracking dogs located the missing man's scent exactly where his coworker had last seen him before abruptly losing it on undisturbed ground. No secondary footprints left the trail, and recent rainfall had preserved the surrounding soil well enough that investigators expected any movement into the forest would have been obvious. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched through the evening, while volunteer teams expanded the search radius overnight. 3 days later, the surveyor's equipment was discovered resting neatly beside a tree approximately 200 yards from the original search area. His GPS receiver remained powered on, his radio battery was still fully charged, and his field notebook had been placed carefully on top of the equipment. The surveyor himself was never found. The second investigation occurred almost 4 years later in Western Virginia after a volunteer firefighter reported seeing distress lights moving across a ridgeline shortly after midnight. Believing stranded hikers might be signaling for help, local rescue crews climbed toward the location before sunrise. Instead of finding campers, they discovered a recently abandoned campsite containing food still cooling over a fire, unopened sleeping bags, and personal belongings scattered exactly as though their owners intended to return within minutes. Vehicle registration records identified the campers as a married couple from Roanoke who had arrived earlier that afternoon. Cell phone records confirmed neither device had left the immediate area, yet extensive searches involving drones, canine teams, and state police aviation units produced no trace of either individual. 6 weeks later, both vehicles remained exactly where they had been parked. The couple has never been located. Unlike the earlier survey case, investigators believed this incident should have produced substantial physical evidence. The ground surrounding the campsite contained hundreds of identifiable impressions left by rescuers, investigators, and wildlife after the initial search began. Yet, forensic specialists documented almost no footprints leading away from the campsite before emergency personnel arrived. The limited impressions recovered belonged only to the couple moving around their own campsite earlier that evening. Detectives found no evidence that anyone else had entered the area, and equally no evidence that either camper had walked far enough away to leave the site on foot. The official report ultimately classified both individuals as missing, despite acknowledging that investigators could not reconstruct how they had left the campsite. The third file originated in West Virginia during November 2019 after a freight train engineer contacted railroad dispatch regarding an unidentified individual standing beside an abandoned section of track shortly before sunrise. The engineer estimated he observed the person for only a few seconds while passing through a remote valley where no public roads existed nearby. Because trespassing incidents occasionally resulted in serious injuries, railroad police responded immediately. They found no individual at the reported location. Instead, officers discovered a backpack containing identification belonging to a wildlife photographer who had been reported missing by family members 2 days earlier. Camera equipment recovered from the backpack remained undamaged, and the memory cards contained photographs taken continuously throughout the previous afternoon. The final image showed an empty stretch of railway taken less than 15 minutes before sunset. No additional photographs were recorded, and investigators never determined how the backpack reached the tracks without signs of recent foot traffic nearby. State investigators reviewing all three cases several years later noticed similarities that had received little attention during the original investigations. None of the missing individuals had financial problems, known conflicts, or medical conditions suggesting voluntary disappearance. Every search began within hours rather than days, greatly increasing the likelihood of recovery. Each location had been examined repeatedly using modern search techniques, including aerial imaging, tracking dogs, digital mapping, and coordinated grid searches. Despite these advantages, investigators consistently recovered personal property while failing to locate the individuals themselves. Experienced search coordinators later acknowledged that such outcomes represented the rarest category of missing person investigations because physical evidence normally expanded rather than diminished as searches continued. Forensic analysts also reviewed environmental conditions across all three cases. Weather remained stable during each disappearance. Rivers were flowing below seasonal averages, reducing the likelihood of flood-related accidents. Wildlife experts found no evidence of dangerous animal encounters, while geologists ruled out sinkholes, abandoned mine collapses, and significant landslides. Every practical explanation examined during the investigations accounted for only isolated pieces of evidence while leaving the broader sequence of events unresolved. As one investigator noted during the final case review, solving a disappearance usually depends upon connecting small details into a coherent timeline. In these investigations, the details themselves appeared reliable. It was the timeline that refused to come together. Today, the three investigations remain open within their respective jurisdictions, although active search operations concluded years ago. Families continue hoping that advances in forensic technology may eventually provide answers unavailable during the original investigations. Detectives remain equally cautious about drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. None of the official reports describe paranormal activity, unexplained creatures, or supernatural events. Instead, they document something investigators often consider even more frustrating: ordinary people vanishing under ordinary circumstances while leaving behind evidence that should have solved the case but somehow never did. Across Appalachia, those files continue to circulate quietly among search professionals and law enforcement officers, not because they prove anything extraordinary, but because they remind experienced investigators that some of the region's most unsettling stories remain unsolved precisely because every reasonable explanation has already been considered. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the 3 files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all three cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. The strange things that happened during those June nights. Deep within the heavy, humid swamps of southern Louisiana, an isolated botanical expedition encountered something entirely unexplained. During the sweltering hot summer of 2017, two highly dedicated researchers established a remote camp. What they recorded over 3 continuous, terrifying nights remains a highly contested mystery among local authorities today. Archived notes from their official state investigation reveal a disturbing timeline that defies simple, logical, scientific explanation. Mark was a 32-year-old professional field botanist tasked with documenting rare endangered swamp orchids. His capable working partner was a 29-year-old highly experienced wildlife photographer named Lisa. Their primary scientific objective required them to camp deep inside the remote bayou away from established trails. The official county file from 2009 mentioned highly unusual animal migration patterns throughout that region. They safely arrived on June 12th and immediately began setting up their heavy equipment near dark water. The first quiet night passed without any significant dangerous incidents as the thoroughly exhausted researchers slept soundly. State records confirm that severe scattered thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific location despite highly ominous weather predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she heard strange, heavy splashing sounds near the bank. She initially assumed a curious large alligator was investigating their sealed waterproof containers near the muddy shore. When she cautiously shined her heavy flashlight outside, the heavy splashing sounds instantly ceased in the darkness. Mark quickly discovered a series of massive, deep indentations in the damp soil the following humid morning. The strange, deep tracks were vaguely humanoid in shape, but they sank nearly 4 inches into mud. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial trapping outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those rumors. Mark carefully photographed the bizarre muddy footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a tall creature. He calmly rationalized that rapidly rising swamp water might have dangerously distorted ordinary wild animal tracks overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during their second dark night when an awful chemical smell arrived. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor resembled rotting meat mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw sulfur. Both dedicated researchers immediately woke up, coughing violently and struggling to breathe properly inside their small tents. Lisa quickly grabbed her emergency satellite radio to call for immediate outside assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully recorded by the regional ranger station then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen heavy force violently shook the solid ground and collapsed the aluminum tent frame. Mark scrambled frantically into the dark open clearing and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a cypress. The strange, glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the ambient background radiation. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly retreated. Morning light quickly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Mark frantically insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining camping gear and hike toward the highway. Lisa completely agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were displaying erratic magnetic directional headings. They were effectively hopelessly lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for disorienting, highly experienced survivalists. The desperate, anxious botanists decided to blindly follow the slow river current, hoping it intersected a road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely directly watched. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth objects moving swiftly. Every single time she abruptly stopped to point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical exhaustion eventually forced them to establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the water. They huddled tightly together by a small, warm fire while clutching their sturdy walking sticks for protection. Around 2 in the morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell dead silent as insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly began to vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the region, but geologists found no evidence. Mark frantically scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the battery exploded. Lisa screamed loudly in absolute terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, staring blankly ahead. Mark slowly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently extinguished the campfire flames. Plunged into total suffocating pitch darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly ran into the treacherous swamp. They hopelessly sprinted blindly through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually separated from each other forever. A commercial swamp airboat tour operator miraculously found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a designated access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor lacerations caused by sharp branches. State records confirm she was immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed police deputies eventually navigated back to retrieve the abandoned campsite, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable canvas tents were completely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hand tools twisted. Mark was tragically never seen again, despite the massive, coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent parishes. Highly trained search dogs completely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the edge of a deep bog. Law enforcement officials strongly suspected the blindly fleeing botanist accidentally fell into the massive, dark, deep sinkhole. However, they could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy camping equipment was melted by extreme temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the localized underground ground vibrations also remained totally unsolved. Lisa completely permanently abandoned her promising wildlife photography career and moved to a bustling, noisy urban city. She absolutely refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable swamp experiences. She eventually quietly wrote a highly obscure anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering psychological mental trauma. Reportedly, she deeply suffered from severe chronic daily insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless entities. Dispatch logs routinely show she frequently called local urban police authorities complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Louisiana swamps remain mostly completely uncharted and thoroughly feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local boat tour operators aggressively discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from exploring that bayou. Official public records conflict regarding the actual total accurate number of missing persons cases linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously venture into the region, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always return completely empty-handed, while a few others emerge with deeply unsettling stories. The absolute total lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence continually frustrates those who believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered thermal camera conveniently completely erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant signature. Vociferous internet skeptics constantly loudly argue that sheer blind panic and total darkness easily transformed a bear. Archive notes carefully gathered from the official police investigation confidently concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, specific, true origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth footprints remains a contested topic. University biology experts easily dismiss the crazy, ridiculous idea of a completely unknown massive swamp animal. They constantly argue that an active, healthy breeding population of large, hidden creatures would leave evidence. No unusual animal hair samples or strange skeletal bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal national government aggressively suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect operations. Official government investigators never confirmed any grand illegal conspiracy and simply permanently closed the bizarre swamp case. In this new story, terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than has home. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archive notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archive notes from the forensic examination describe the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archived notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways, carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected 2 independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the 2 timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits. Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across 4 independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archived notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable, heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour, when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials firmly suspected the quickly fleeing couple accidentally entirely hallucinated the terrifying massive entity. However, they absolutely could not realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains thoroughly abandoned and heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University biology science experts easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine: arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow 2-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia, and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the People started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archive notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The light slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely, completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light quickly, clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly, entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials firmly suspected the quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly, thoroughly uncharted and heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total, highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange, bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. state records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient, predatory anomalies. The Whispering Ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift, as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, All four men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lynn abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lynn crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lynn standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lynn turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lynn remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining three men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all four men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by two local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lynn never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium, where he continued to insist until his death that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, the canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for four forgotten men.